The dust settled on everything Lottie owned. It was a fine, pale powder that coated the leaves of her struggling corn stalks, filmed over the water in the bucket, and worked its way into the very grain of the unpainted boards of her cabin. She had come to think of it as a second skin, a constant reminder of the parched, unforgiving land she was trying to tame. The farm wasn't much, just a sliver of earth her late husband Thomas had marked on a map before the fever took him on the trail. She'd pushed on alone, leading their tired mule the last 100 miles to this spot, a place called Providence. The name felt like a cruel joke. There was nothing providential about it. The town of Providence kept its distance. When she rode in for supplies, a hush would fall over the general store. Women would pull their children closer, their faces tight with a judgment she could feel like a physical blow. Men would stop their conversations, their eyes following her with a flat, unwelcoming stare. She was an outsider, a widow who had appeared from the empty plains with nothing but a mule and a stubborn set in her jaw. They did not know her story, so they invented one. Whispers followed her like burrs on a saddle blanket, clinging and sharp. They said she was unlucky. They said she was godless for burying her own husband without a preacher. Some, the more fearful ones, whispered the word quitch when she gathered herbs from the creek bed. Lottie ignored them. She had learned long ago that words were just air. It was the silence that was heavy, the silence of her one-room cabin at night, the silence of the empty chair across her small table. She worked from sunup to sundown, her hands chapped and raw, her back a constant burning ache. She coaxed life from the dry soil, fought off rabbits and rust, and mended the leaky roof of the small barn. She was not unlucky. She was a survivor, and she was not a witch. She was merely a woman who had paid attention to the things her grandmother had taught her, the old knowledge of root and leaf, of poultice and tea. It was a knowledge that had kept her alive when everything else had failed. The knock on her door came late one afternoon, sharp and authoritative. It was not the hesitant rap of a lost traveler. Lottie's hand went instinctively to the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth. She did not open the door right away. Instead, she peered through a crack in the chinking, her heart a tight drum against her ribs. A man sat on a Aldgebube horse, the animal's coat gleaming like polished walnut in the slanted sunlight. The man himself was broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by the brim of a dark hat. He wore dust and leather like a uniform, and the set of his jaw was as hard as the land around them. She recognized him, Nate. His ranch, the largest in the territory, bordered her small claim. His word, she'd heard, was the closest thing to law in Providence. She opened the door just enough to show her face, the poker still gripped tight in her hand. "Can I help you?" Her voice was steady, betraying none of the fear that prickled her skin. Nate did not dismount, his eyes, a startlingly clear gray, took in the sight of her, the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the defiant lift of her chin, the worn homespun of her dress. He looked from her to the poker, and a muscle in his jaw twitched. He reached into his coat, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was reaching for a gun. Instead, he pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. It clinked with the sound of coins. "The town paid me to run you off," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. There was no pleasure in it, only a flat statement of fact. "Mrs. Gable and the others, they collected this. They want you gone by the end of the week." Lottie's knuckles went white around the poker. Of course, Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, a woman whose piety was as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of glass. She had felt the woman's hatred from the first day. "And you're their errand boy?" The words were out before she could stop them, sharp with a bitterness she rarely allowed herself to show. Nate's gaze didn't waver. He looked at her small, tidy garden, at the neatly stacked firewood beside the door, at the patched but sturdy fence line. He saw not a threat, but a testament to relentless effort. He had built his own empire from nothing, and he recognized the grit it took to make something grow where nothing wanted to. He saw himself in her, a younger, more desperate version, and it unsettled him profoundly. He had come here expecting a vagrant, a problem to be removed. He found a woman building a home against impossible odds. I'm telling you this so you know what's coming, he said, ignoring her question. He tossed the pouch of coins onto the dusty ground between them. It landed with a soft final thud. They won't stop with me. When I tell them you refused, they'll send someone else. Someone who won't bother with a warning. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the depths of his gray eyes, she saw something other than the cold authority she expected. It was a flicker of what? Regret? A shared understanding of loneliness? He had lost his wife years ago, she'd heard. Died in childbirth. The knowledge hung in the air between them, an unspoken tragedy that connected their two solitudes. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Because a person ought to have a choice in how they face a fight, he said. Without another word, he reined his horse around, the animal's powerful haunches bunching as it turned. He rode away, leaving the pouch of silver dollars lying in the dust like a coiled snake. Lottie stood in her doorway, the iron poker suddenly heavy in her hand, and watched him until he was just a silhouette against the blood-red sunset. She did not feel saved. She felt the cold, hard certainty that the fight had just begun. The next few days were a quiet torment. Every creak of the cabin walls, every rustle of wind in the dry grass sent a jolt of fear through her. She kept the door barred and the poker close. She worked with her head on a swivel, constantly scanning the horizon for riders. The town's money lay where Nate had thrown it, the leather darkening under the relentless sun. She wouldn't touch it. It was tainted with their hatred, their fear. Taking it would be an admission of defeat, and Lottie was done with defeat. Her encounter with Nate had changed something, though. He had looked at her, truly looked at her, and had not seen what the others saw. He had seen a woman working the land. He had offered her not help, not pity, but a warning. It was a stark, unadorned form of respect, and it was more than anyone in Providence had ever given her. She found herself thinking of his gray eyes, of the way a muscle had jumped in his jaw. He was a man locked inside himself, she sensed. A man who carried his own heavy burdens. The proving came on a Tuesday. It arrived in the form of a frantic, dust-covered man on a lathered horse. He was one of Nate's ranch hands, a man named Jed she'd seen in town once or twice. He practically fell from the saddle, his face a attack of desperation. "My boy," he gasped, his hat clutched in his hands. "It's my boy, Abel. The fever's got him bad. The doctor, he says there's nothing more to be done, says we should pray." His voice broke on the last word. "My wife," she heard the talk. "About you. About your ways with herbs." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Please, I'll give you anything." Lottie's first instinct was to say no. This was a trap. If the boy died, they would call her a murderer as well as a witch. It was too great a risk. But then she saw the raw agony in the father's face, an agony she knew all too well, the helpless terror of watching someone you love slip away. She thought of Thomas, his body burning with a fire no one could quench. "I am not a doctor," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I make no promises." "But I will come." She gathered her things, a bundle of dried yarrow, willow bark, a tin of peppermint leaves. She saddled her mule and followed Jed back toward the cluster of small houses that served ranch hands. As they rode, the whispers of the town seemed to mock her. What was she doing? She was walking directly into the fire she'd been warned about. The small house was stifling, thick with the scent of sickness and fear. A young woman, her face pale and tear-streaked, sat by a small cot where a boy of about 7 lay tossing and turning, his skin flushed a terrifying red. Nate stood in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, his face a grim, unreadable mask. His presence filled the small space, making it feel even hotter, even more airless. He had not expected Jed to go to her. His own wife had died of a fever after their child was born. He had watched the town doctor, helpless and sweating, and had felt a rage so profound it had hollowed him out. He did not believe in miracles. He did not believe in cures. Lottie did not acknowledge him. Her focus was entirely on the child. She knelt by the cot, her movements calm and deliberate. She laid a cool, damp cloth on Abel's forehead. She spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, though he was delirious and could not hear. She crushed the willow bark and yarrow, steeping them in hot water Jed's wife brought from the stove. The bitter, earthy scent filled the room, cutting through the smell of sickness. "Help me sit him up," she said to the boy's mother. Together, they propped the child up. Lottie held the cup to his lips, coaxing him to drink the bitter tea a spoonful at a time. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, changing the cloths, administering the tea, her presence a pool of calm in the frantic sea of the parents' fear. Nate watched from the doorway, silent and immovable. He watched her hands, how sure and gentle they were. He watched her face, the intense concentration in her eyes. She was not praying or chanting incantations. She was working, applying a knowledge that was as practical and real as setting a fence post. He saw no witchcraft. He saw competence. He saw a strength that shamed the town's ignorant fear. He was watching a woman save a life when a man of medicine had already given up, and it cracked something deep inside him. A wall of grief and cynicism he had spent years building. Sometime after midnight, the fever broke, the boy's breathing eased, and a sheen of sweat broke out on his skin. He fell into a deep, natural sleep. The crisis had passed. Jed's wife began to weep, silent tears of relief streaming down her face. Jed grabbed Lottie's hand, his own rough palm covering hers. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "God bless you." Lottie simply nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She stood up, her back protesting, and finally met Nate's gaze across the room. His gray eyes were no longer unreadable. They were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that made her breath catch in her throat. He knew, as she did, that this act of healing had not saved her from the town's judgment. It had only deepened the divide, drawing a line in the dust between those who would see a miracle and those who would see a threat. He gave her a short, sharp nod, a gesture of profound, grudging respect. Then he turned and disappeared into the night. The story of Abel's recovery spread through Providence like a grass fire. For Jed and his wife, Lottie was an angel of mercy. For a few others on the edges of the town's rigid society, she became a figure of quiet respect. But for Mrs. Gable and her flock, it was confirmation of their darkest suspicions. A doctor had failed. This strange woman had succeeded. It could only be the devil's work. The hostility in town grew colder, sharper. The whispers now had an edge of real menace. Nate began to find reasons to ride the fence line that bordered Lottie's property. He told himself he was just checking on his stock, but he knew it was a lie. He was checking on her, a week after she'd saved Jed's son. He found her struggling to reset a heavy corner post of her fence, one that a wild steer had clearly knocked loose. She was using a makeshift lever, her face strained with the effort. He dismounted without a word. She looked up, startled, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of a dusty forearm. They stood in an awkward silence for a moment, the vast, empty prairie stretching out around them. "That needs a deeper hole," he said finally, his voice gruff. "I'm aware," she replied, her own voice tight with frustration. He took the post-hole digger from the ground beside her. His hands were large and calloused, engulfing the wooden handles. He began to work, his powerful shoulders bunching with each thrust into the hard-packed earth. Lottie stood back and watched, a strange mix of gratitude and resentment warring within her. She didn't want to need his help, but the simple, undeniable fact was that he could do, in 10 minutes, what would have taken her 2 hours. They worked together for the better part of an hour, speaking only when necessary, passing tools back and forth. Their hands brushed once as he handed her a length of wire, and the contact was like a spark of lightning on the dry plains. She pulled her hand back, as if burned. He pretended not to notice, but she saw the way his jaw tightened. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they couldn't say. When the post was set, solid and true in the ground, he gathered his tools. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Keep your door barred at night," he said, and swung himself up onto his horse. He rode off without looking back, leaving her with the scent of his horse and the lingering warmth of his presence. A few weeks later, her well pump broke. The handle went slack, and no amount of effort would draw water. It meant hauling water in 2 heavy buckets from the creek a quarter of a mile away, a back-breaking, time-consuming task. She spent 2 days at it, her shoulders screaming in protest, her hands rubbed raw. On the third morning, she awoke to the sound of a wagon and quiet voices. Peeking through her window, she saw Nate with 2 of his men. They were unloading a new, heavy iron pump mechanism. She pulled on her boots and went outside, her heart thumping. Nate was already working, his coat off despite the morning chill, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, sun-browned forearms. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. He didn't look up from his work. "Easier than watching you break your back," he grunted, wrenching the old, rusted assembly free. His men worked with a quiet efficiency, clearly following his lead. They respected him, she could see that. Feared him a little, too. By mid-morning, the new pump was installed, the handle moving with moothsome satisfying resistance. Clear. Cold water gushed from the spout. Nate sent his men back to the ranch. He stood by the well, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. Lottie brought him a dipper of the fresh water. He took it, his fingers brushing hers, and drank deeply. The simple act felt impossibly intimate. "I can't pay you for this," she said, gesturing to the new pump. "Didn't ask for pay," he replied, handing the dipper back. He looked at her then, his gray eyes searching her face. He saw the exhaustion she tried to hide, the fierce pride that kept her going. His own loneliness was a constant, dull ache in his chest, an emptiness he had long accepted as his lot. But standing here in the quiet of her small, stubborn farm, the ache was sharper, more insistent. She was a mirror, showing him not only what he had lost, but what he had been too afraid to seek again. Before he could say something he might regret, he turned to leave. He stopped at the edge of her porch, where a large sack was resting. "Flour," he said, nodding toward it. "Jed's wife sent it. Said her boy's been eating like a horse." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Jed's wife couldn't afford a sack that large. But it was a kindness wrapped in a plausible excuse, a way for him to provide for her without wounding her pride. He mounted his horse and was gone before she could find the words to thank him. The slow burn of their connection smoldered through the late summer. He never stayed long. His visits were always framed by a purpose. A loose shingle on her roof he'd spotted, a question about a stray calf, a warning about a storm rolling in from the mountains. They were excuses, thin veils for his need to see her, to assure himself that she was all right. And with each visit, the space between them shrank. The storm he warned her about arrived with a savage fury. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. Lottie was in the barn, trying to soothe her frightened mule, when she heard the sickening crack of splitting wood. A massive cottonwood at the edge of the clearing had given way, its heavy branches crashing down onto the corner of the barn roof. The whole structure groaned in protest. Rain lashed down, so thick she could barely see. Through the deluge, she saw a rider approaching at a gallop. It was Nate. He must have seen the tree fall from his own property. He swung down from his horse, his face grim, his clothes already soaked through. "We have to brace it, or the whole thing will go," he yelled over the roar of the wind. They worked in a frantic, desperate unison. He shouted instructions, and she obeyed without question, her fear eclipsed by the urgency of the task. They hauled heavy timbers from a pile behind the barn, using them as makeshift supports. The rain plastered her hair to her face and her dress to her body. At one point, a section of the damaged roof gave way, sending a cascade of splintered wood and shingles raining down. Nate lunged, grabbing her arm and pulling her hard against his chest, shielding her with his own body. The world seemed to stop. All she was aware of was the solid wall of his chest, the thunder of his heart against her ear, the strength of his arm wrapped around her. He smelled of rain and wet leather and the clean, masculine scent of himself. He held her for a second longer than necessary, his breath warm against her hair. When he finally let go, they were both breathing heavily, but not just from the exertion. The air between them crackled with a tension more powerful than the storm. They finished securing the barn just as the worst of the storm passed. They stood in the barn's relative shelter, dripping and exhausted. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It was too dangerous." "Seems I don't make sensible choices where you're concerned," he said, his voice low and raw. He took a step closer, his gray eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. He raised a hand as if to touch her face, then let it drop, his fist clenching at his side. The battle within him was plain to see, the need and the terror of that need. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the rain. Mounting his horse and riding away, Lottie stood shivering in the barn doorway, watching him go, her hand pressed to her heart. She was no longer just afraid of the town. She was afraid of the hope this broken, powerful man was starting to build inside her. Mrs. Gable saw the repaired barn roof from the road 2 days later. She saw the new well pump. She heard the continued whispers of gratitude from Jed's family. Lottie was not fleeing, she was putting down roots. And worse, she was doing it under the protection of Nate, the one man in Providence whose power rivaled her own social authority. It was an intolerable challenge to the order she so carefully maintained. Her fear and jealousy curdled into a righteous, venomous fury. She decided it was time to stop paying others to do her work. It was time to use the one weapon no one could defy, the Word of God. Twisted to her own purpose, she discovered her ammunition during a quilting circle. One of the women, a notorious gossip, mentioned hearing that Lottie had buried her husband herself on the trail. There had been no service, no preacher, no consecrated ground. It was all Mrs. Gable needed. A woman who lived alone, who dabbled in strange herbs, who consorted with the devil to heal a child, and who had denied her own husband a Christian burial. The narrative was complete. Lottie was not just an outcast. She was a blight, a godless sinner, whose very presence endangered the souls of Providence. She called a special meeting at the church for that Sunday evening. It wasn't framed as a trial, but as a community discussion on public welfare and morality. Everyone knew who the subject was. The news reached Nate through his foreman, Jed, who came to the main ranch house looking pale and worried. "It's Mrs. Gable," Jed said, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "She's rallied half the town. They're saying Lottie's a heathen. They're going to vote to have her run out. Forcibly this time. The sheriff won't stand against the preacher's wife." A cold, familiar rage settled in Nate's gut. He had stood by once before and let ignorance and fear dictate terms, and it had cost him everything. He saw his late wife's face, pale and feverish, and the memory was a knife in his heart. He would not let it happen again. He rode to Lottie's farm as dusk was settling, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. He found her sitting on her porch steps, watching the sunset, a sad, resigned look on her face. She had already heard the news. Word traveled fast in a small town, especially bad news. He dismounted, his face set in hard lines. He had come to tell her to fight, to stand with her. But as he looked at her, so small and alone against the vast, darkening landscape, his old damage, his ingrained habit of closing himself off to protect himself from pain, rose up like a wall. The thought of losing her, of fighting for her and failing as he had failed his wife, was a terror he could not face. The safest thing, the most rational thing, was for her to go. "You should leave, Lottie," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It's not safe for you here anymore. Pack what you can. I'll give you a horse and enough money to get to Sheridan." Lottie looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for the man who had fixed her fence, who had pulled her from the path of a falling roof. She found only a stranger, a cold, powerful man advising a strategic retreat. The hope that had been blooming in her chest withered and died. It was worse than a threat from Mrs. Gable. It was a betrayal from the one person she had started to trust. "I thought you were different," she whispered, her voice choked with a pain that was sharper than any fear. "I thought you saw me, but you're just like them. You see a problem that needs to be moved along." She stood up and walked back into her cabin, closing the door firmly behind her. The sound of the bar sliding into place was as final as a gunshot. Nate stood alone in the twilight, her words echoing in the sudden, crushing silence. He had come to save her, and in his own cowardly fear, he had just driven her away himself. He mounted his horse and rode back to his empty ranch house, the weight of his failure a physical sickness in his stomach. The lowest point had arrived, a cold, dark night of the soul for them both, separated by a wall of his making. Inside her cabin, Lottie moved with a numb, mechanical purpose. She packed a small canvas sack with the few things that mattered. A small tin of her grandmother's herbs, a faded tintype of her husband, a spare dress. Every object was a reminder of a life she had tried to build. The sturdy shelves Nate had quietly installed one afternoon while she was away. The smooth handle of the new well pump. The solid feel of the door he had rehung so it no longer stuck. His presence was everywhere. A ghostly testament to a connection she had foolishly believed was real. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. She was not just losing a home. She was losing the first flicker of belonging she had felt in years. She would leave at first light, disappearing back into the wilderness from which she had come. Nate sat in the dark of his study, a bottle of whiskey untouched on the desk before him. The house was silent, just as it had been for years. But tonight the silence was different. It was not the familiar quiet of solitude. It was the suffocating emptiness of a future he had just thrown away. Lottie's words, "I thought you were different," played over and over in his mind. He had spent years building his ranch, his reputation, his walls. He was Nate, the man who needed no one, the man whose word was law. But it was all a lie. He was a coward, hiding from the ghost of a wife he couldn't save. And now he was letting his fear drive away the first woman who had made him feel alive since her death. He thought of her standing up to him that first day, poker in hand. He thought of her calm competence at the bedside of a dying child. He thought of her small, work-ruined hand in his. To let the narrow-minded, fearful people of Providence destroy that, to stand by and watch them extinguish that light, would be a sin far greater than any Mrs. Gable could conjure. It would be the death of his own soul. He stood up, the decision made. He would not be the man who advised retreat. He would be the man Lottie had thought he was. He strode to his coat, pulsing the small, heavy pouch of the town's money from the inner pocket. He had never even opened it. He walked out of his house and rode not toward Lottie's farm, but toward the faint glow of light from the town. He rode toward the church. The church was full, the air thick with self-righteousness. Mrs. Gable was at the pulpit, her voice ringing with condemnation, painting a picture of Lottie as a dangerous heretic. Nate walked in, his spurs clicking loudly on the wooden floorboards. Every head turned. A shocked silence fell over the congregation. He walked straight down the aisle to the front, his face like carved granite. He stopped before Mrs. Gable and, without a word, threw the leather pouch onto the pulpit. It landed with a heavy, metallic slap. "This is your blood money," he said, his voice low and dangerous, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "I never touched it. You paid me to run off a widow who works harder than any man in this town. A woman whose only crime is that she will not bow to your fear." He turned to face the crowd. "You talk of morality. Let me tell you about morality. 2 weeks ago, Jed's boy was dying. Your doctor gave up. Your prayers went unanswered. This woman," he said, his voice rising with a passion no one had ever heard from him, came when she was asked. She used her knowledge and her courage, and she saved that boy's life. Is that the work of a sinner? He stared down the faces of the people who worked for him, who bought his cattle, who lived on land he had tamed. "Her farm is under my protection. Any man or woman who bothers her will answer directly to me." As he spoke, another figure appeared in the church doorway. It was Lottie. She had been hitching her mule to her small cart, ready to flee into the pre-dawn darkness, when a profound and sudden certainty had settled over her. She was done running. This was her home. She had fought for it, bled for it. She would not let them take it without looking them in the eye. She walked down the aisle, her back straight, her head held high. She carried a small basket of the very herbs she'd used to save Abel. She came to a stop beside Nate, a silent, unshakable partner. She faced Mrs. Gable, her voice clear and steady. "You speak of God's law, Mrs. Gable," Lottie said. Does God's law command you to cast out a widow? Does it command you to stand by and let a child perish from a fever when a simple poultice of yarrow could save him? She held up the basket. You call this witchcraft. My grandmother called it mercy. Which do you believe God would prefer? A wave of shame washed over the congregation. They looked from Nate's hard protective stance to Lottie's quiet, unimpeachable dignity. They saw not a witch and her dark protector, but a good woman and a powerful man standing for what was right. Mrs. Gable stood frozen, her face contorted with fury, her power broken. The town had been forced to choose, and in the face of Nate's authority and Lottie's courage, they chose decency. The meeting dissolved in murmurs and averted gazes. The fight was over. Weeks turned into a month. The autumn air grew crisp, and the leaves on the cottonwoods turned a brilliant, defiant gold. The town treated Lottie with a new, cautious respect. A few people, led by Jed's wife, began to stop by her farm, sometimes for a bit of peppermint for a clicky baby, other times just to share a cup of coffee. The wall of isolation around her had crumbled. Nate came by one evening as the sun was setting. He no longer needed an excuse. He dismounted and walked up to the porch where she was sitting, shelling beans into a large wooden bowl. He was holding something in his hand. He sat on the step below her, the comfortable silence stretching between them. He had not made a grand declaration in the church. He had simply stated a fact. She was under his protection, but they both knew it was more than that. It was a public claiming, an irreversible choice. He opened his hand. On his calloused palm rested a small bird, intricately carved from a piece of pale wood. Its wings were swept back as if in flight. My father used to make these, he said, his voice quiet. He made dozens of them for my mother. She kept them on the mantelpiece. He looked up at her, his gray eyes vulnerable for the first time. I haven't carved one since he died. He was not just giving her a piece of wood. He was giving her his past, his grief, the locked-away part of his heart. Lottie put down her bowl of beans and gently took the bird from his hand. Her fingers closed around it, the wood smooth and warm. It's beautiful, she whispered. He reached out and covered her hand with his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. It was a simple, profound gesture of possession, of permanence. The Frontier was still a wild and dangerous place, but here on this small, stubborn farm, they had found shelter. He was no longer the town's cold enforcer, and she was no longer the outcast widow. He had saved her from the town, and she, with her quiet strength and healing touch, had saved him from himself. They sat together on the porch, his hand covering hers, and watched the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky, the promise of a shared future finally, peacefully beginning.